The Appalachian Husband and Pregnant Wife, Too Evil for History Books. The Crawfords of Kentucky. A historical documentary investigation. In November 1931, a hunting party discovered a cabin 30 miles up the Chandler River in Alaska's Brooks Range. Inside, they found a woman's body, perfectly preserved by the cold, sitting in a rocking chair with her hands positioned on an abdomen swollen with late-stage pregnancy. On the table beside her lay a journal bound in what appeared to be tanned human skin. Opened to a final entry dated September 19, 1931. Thomas has finished the preparation. The child kicks inside me, eager to be born into what we have made. We have taken 13 lives to create the conditions for one life, a life that will be born understanding what we understand, seeing what we see, capable of what we will become. The exchange is complete. Tomorrow we cross together. Signed, Margaret Helena Crawford, age 25, and Thomas Isaiah Crawford, age 31. The hunters found no sign of Thomas Crawford. More disturbing, when physicians examined Margaret's body, they discovered the fetus had been dead for approximately 6 weeks, meaning Margaret had continued writing in her journal, continued describing her pregnancy as active and viable for weeks after the child inside her had died. This discovery was shocking. Wait, before we proceed to the archives. If this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. The discovery was made by 3 trappers, James Kowalski, Henry Chen, and a Gwich'in guide named Robert Moses, who were traversing the Chandler drainage in preparation for the winter trapping season. The cabin sat on a bench of land above the river, surrounded by spruce forest, in an area where no structure should have existed according to Territorial Land Office records. Kowalski's statement to the Alaska Territorial Police, filed November 28, 1931, describes the discovery. We came upon the cabin around midday. It was well constructed, relatively new, maybe 2 or 3 years old at most. Smoke was coming from the chimney, so we assumed someone was home. We called out, no response. We approached the door, it was ajar, and looked inside. That's when we saw her. A woman sitting in a rocking chair, hands on her pregnant belly, eyes open. She was clearly dead, but preserved by the cold. She looked like she might start talking at any moment. The cabin interior was disturbing. The walls were covered with symbols carved into the wood, not any writing I recognized, but elaborate, careful symbols that seemed to form patterns. The floor had been painted with what looked like a map, though a map of what I couldn't say. Not terrain I recognized, more like a diagram of something conceptual. And there were containers, mason jars, lined up on a shelf. 13 jars. Each contained what appeared to be a human tongue preserved in some kind of fluid. Each jar was labeled with a name, a date, and the word silenced. The investigation that followed uncovered one of the most methodical and philosophically elaborate series of crimes in Alaska's history. Crimes that the territorial government, after extensive review, decided could not be made fully public because the motivations and methods were too sophisticated to present in legal proceedings without risking copycat crimes by individuals who might be inspired by the perpetrator's reasoning. Margaret Helena Brown was born in 1906 in Harlan County, Kentucky, the daughter of a coal mine supervisor and a schoolteacher. County records and family letters preserved in the Harlan County Historical Society describe her as exceptionally intelligent, reading by age 3, completing advanced mathematics by age 10, developing philosophical interests by her early teens that her family found troubling. A letter from her mother to a cousin, dated 1920, when Margaret was 14, describes, "Margaret has become increasingly difficult to manage, She questions everything, not with childish petulance, but with genuine philosophical inquiry that I lack the education to address. Yesterday she asked me, "Mother, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, then He created humans knowing exactly what choices we would make, which means we have no actual free will, which means we cannot be morally responsible for our actions, which means the entire concept of sin is incoherent. How do you reconcile this?" I told her such questions are prideful and inappropriate for a young lady. She looked at me with such pity and said, "Mother, you've just told me that thinking is inappropriate. That's how they keep women subservient, by teaching us that our own minds are dangerous to us." I don't know where she learned such ideas. Margaret attended Harlan High School but was expelled in her junior year for disruptive philosophical discussions that undermined the moral education of other students. The specific incident that triggered her expulsion, according to school board minutes, involved Margaret leading a discussion in which she argued that morality was entirely subjective, that no action was inherently good or evil, and that any behavior could be justified if one simply changed the philosophical framework used to evaluate it. The school principal, Reverend Thomas Whitfield, wrote in his expulsion recommendation, "Miss Brown is intelligent but dangerous. She uses her intelligence not to pursue truth, but to deconstruct it, not to build moral character, but to demolish the possibility of moral judgment." She argues that because morality is a human construct rather than a divine absolute, we are free to construct any moral system we choose. When I pointed out that such relativism would permit any atrocity, she replied, "Yes, exactly. That's the point. The universe doesn't care what we do. Only we care. And we only care because we've been trained to care by social conditioning. If we can step outside that conditioning, we can act with perfect freedom. This is not youthful rebellion. This is philosophical nihilism of a particularly sophisticated and therefore particularly dangerous type." After her expulsion, Margaret worked as a clerk in her father's mine office, where she met Thomas Isaiah Crawford in 1926. Thomas was 26 years old, an engineer who had been hired to improve mine safety following a series of accidents. He shared Margaret's philosophical interests and, as would later become clear, her willingness to pursue those interests to their logical conclusions regardless of moral constraints. Thomas Crawford was born in 1900 in Floyd County, Kentucky, to a family of small farmers. He was self-educated, having left school at age 12 to work but continuing to read extensively, particularly philosophy, mathematics, and theoretical physics. His personal library, later seized by authorities, contained heavily annotated works by Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Max Stirner, and various texts on evolutionary theory and social Darwinism. A former co-worker at the mine, interviewed by territorial investigators in 1931, described Thomas. "He was brilliant but cold. He could solve engineering problems no one else could solve, but he had no emotional connection to the people those solutions would protect. When we'd have accidents, men crushed or burned, Thomas would analyze the mechanical failures with clinical detachment. Once I said to him, 'Doesn't it bother you when men die?' He looked at me like I'd asked a stupid question and said, 'Why would it bother me? They're not me.' Their deaths have no more emotional significance to me than the death of any other organism I don't know personally. We mourn strangers only because we've been conditioned to extend empathy broadly, but that conditioning is arbitrary. I choose not to be governed by it." When Thomas and Margaret met, the recognition was immediate and mutual. In Margaret's journal, the one found in the cabin, which begins in 1926 and continues until 1931, the first entry about Thomas reads, "I have met someone who thinks as I think, who has reached the same conclusions I have reached, who is not afraid to acknowledge that morality is simply a control mechanism and that we are under no objective obligation to submit to it. Thomas is extraordinary." When I told him my thoughts about the arbitrariness of ethical systems, he didn't recoil or condemn. He said, "You're absolutely correct. The question is what we do with that understanding." Most people who arrive at philosophical nihilism become depressed or self-destructive because they still retain emotional conditioning toward valuing life and seeking meaning. But what if we could strip away that conditioning entirely? What if we could think and act from a position of pure rational self-interest, unconstrained by inherited moral programming? What might we be capable of achieving? They married in 1927 over the objections of both families. Margaret's father refused to attend the wedding. In a letter to Margaret, he wrote, "You are marrying a man without conscience, and you have become a woman without conscience. I pray that God will soften your hearts before you do irreparable harm to yourselves or others, but I fear your pride has advanced too far for prayer to penetrate." For 2 years, Thomas and Margaret lived in Harlan County, both working at the mine. Thomas as an engineer, Margaret as a bookkeeper. To outward appearances, they were a normal young couple. But Margaret's journal reveals they were engaged in what they called the project, a systematic attempt to eliminate their own moral conditioning and prepare themselves for what they described as ascending beyond human ethical constraints. From an entry dated March 1928, Thomas and I have begun the psychological exercises. We start with small transgressions, lying when truth would serve us equally well, taking small items that belong to others when we can do so without consequence, sabotaging the work of colleagues who compete with us for advancement. The goal is not the transgression itself, but the elimination of guilt or discomfort that normally accompanies transgression. Each time we act against our conditioning and observe our emotional response, we work to diminish that response through rational analysis. We remind ourselves, this guilt is not an objective moral truth. It is merely the echo of social training. It has no more validity than any other conditioned response. It can be unlearned. From July 1928, we have progressed to greater transgressions. Thomas has been deliberately making decisions that lead to minor accidents at the mine. Nothing fatal, but injuries that could have been prevented had he implemented safety measures he knows would work. He does this to desensitize himself to the suffering of others, to observe his own reactions and systematically diminish any empathic response. I have been spreading false rumors that have damaged the reputations and relationships of several people in town. Again, the goal is not the harm itself, but the elimination of my own discomfort at causing harm. We are teaching ourselves to be free of the emotional conditioning that constrains most humans. From December 1928, we have reached a critical understanding. We cannot complete the project here. We are surrounded by people who knew us before we began this work, people whose expectations and judgments create social pressure that interferes with our psychological development. We need isolation. We need a place where we can work without surveillance, without social consequence, without the accumulated weight of community moral standards. We need a frontier, somewhere remote enough that we can operate without interference, harsh enough that survival requires ruthlessness, lawless enough that conventional morality has minimal enforcement. Thomas has been researching options. Alaska seems promising. In March 1929, Thomas and Margaret Crawford resigned their positions, sold their possessions, and departed Kentucky for Alaska. They arrived in Fairbanks in June 1929 and spent the summer purchasing supplies, learning wilderness skills, and researching remote areas where they could establish themselves beyond the reach of territorial authorities. By September 1929, they had selected a location on the Chandalar River in the Brooks Range, remote, difficult to access, far from any settlements. They built their cabin over the winter of 1929-30, working entirely alone, creating a structure that was both functional shelter and, as the journal makes clear, a kind of temple dedicated to their philosophical project. From January 1930, the cabin is nearly complete. We have built more than shelter. We have built a space of pure freedom where no external moral authority can reach us. where we can conduct our work without interference. The isolation is total. We are 40 miles from the nearest human beings. We will see no one unless we choose to seek them out. We are accountable to no one. We answer only to our own rational self-interest. This is what freedom looks like. The journal entries from 1930 describe the Crawfords establishing their life in the Brooks Range, hunting, trapping, maintaining their cabin, enduring the brutal winters. But they also describe the escalation of the project into what they called the preparation. From March 1930, we have identified what we believe to be the final barrier to our complete liberation from moral conditioning, the prohibition against killing humans. This is the deepest, strongest moral conditioning we carry. It is reinforced not only by social training, but by evolutionary programming. Humans are social animals, and we carry instincts against intraspecies killing that exist below the level of conscious thought. If we can eliminate this prohibition, if we can kill humans with the same emotional neutrality we feel when killing game animals, then we will have achieved complete freedom from moral constraint. But this cannot be rushed. It requires careful preparation. What followed was a year of escalating exercises designed to desensitize the Crawfords to violence, death, and suffering. The journal describes these exercises in clinical detail, beginning with killing animals in increasingly prolonged ways to observe their own emotional responses, progressing to causing themselves physical pain to diminish their pain aversion responses, then to causing each other pain to eliminate empathic responses even towards someone they loved. From August 1930, Thomas and I conducted an exercise today in which we took turns inflicting burns on each other's arms. The goal was twofold: to experience pain without fear or avoidance, and to cause pain to someone we care about without guilt or hesitation. I watched Thomas press the hot iron to my skin and felt proud that he could do so without wavering, without apologizing, without emotional distortion of the necessary action. When it was my turn, I found I could inflict the same on him with perfect steadiness. We have eliminated the emotional barriers that prevent clear action. We are becoming what we intended to become. By October 1930, the Crawfords had decided they were ready to extend the preparation to include actual human subjects. But they were careful, methodical, and patient in their approach. They understood that killing in the Alaska wilderness created risks. Missing persons would eventually be noticed. Searches would be conducted. Patterns might emerge. They needed to be strategic. Their strategy, as outlined in the journal, was to target individuals who were already isolated, transient, or whose disappearances would be unlikely to trigger intensive investigation. Trappers working alone, prospectors traveling between camps, indigenous people traveling between villages who might be presumed to have been lost to weather or wildlife. The Crawfords would encounter these individuals, offer hospitality or assistance, gain trust, and then act when opportunity presented itself. From November 1930, we have identified our first subject, a trapper named Joseph Garrett, working a line approximately 20 miles downriver. He is alone, has been in the area only one season, has no family in Alaska according to his own statements. He stopped at our cabin 3 days ago, seeking to borrow tools. We were hospitable. He is planning to return in 2 weeks to return the tools. When he does, we will conduct the first trial. Thomas and I have discussed the method extensively. It must be done in a way that allows us to observe our own reactions clearly, without the distortion of fear or adrenaline. Poison seems appropriate for the first trial. It allows for observation, for the gradual process that will let us examine our responses as the subject transitions from living to dead. The journal entry dated November 28, 1930, describes the first killing in disturbing detail, not because it dwells on the violence, but because of the clinical detachment with which it is recorded. The Crawfords poisoned Garrett's coffee with what Margaret identifies as strychnine obtained from wolf poison we acquired in Fairbanks. They observed his symptoms for several hours, taking notes on his pain responses, their own emotional reactions, and what Margaret describes as the philosophical implications of watching a human organism cease functioning. The most interesting observation, Margaret wrote, is how little emotional response either Thomas or I experienced. We watched Joseph die with the same clinical interest we would feel watching any biological process. The sounds he made, the movements of his body, his attempts to speak, all of this registered as data, not as suffering. We have successfully eliminated the empathetic response that would normally make such observation traumatic. This is progress. The journal documents that the Crawfords removed Garrett's tongue after death, the first of 13 they would collect. The stated reason for this was both practical and symbolic. The tongue is the organ of speech, the physical manifestation of the capacity to tell one's story, to call for help, to be heard by others. By taking the tongue, we symbolically complete the silencing that death has begun. We are ensuring these individuals cannot speak against us, not physically, not metaphysically, not in any sense. They are erased. Over the next year, between November 1930 and December 1931, the Crawfords killed 12 more people. The journal documents each killing with the same clinical detachment, each entry noting the method used, the observations made, and the assessment of the Crawfords' own psychological state. The victims, later identified through the labeled jars and cross-reference with missing persons reports, included 5 trappers working alone in remote areas, 3 prospectors traveling between camps, 2 Gwich'in travelers, a man and a woman, who stopped at the Crawford cabin seeking assistance with a broken sled, a territorial mail carrier who had gotten lost in a storm, and a missionary traveling between villages. Each person was killed by a different method. This variation was deliberate, as Margaret explained in a journal entry. We must not allow habit to replace conscious choice. Each killing must be approached freshly, methodically, with full awareness. Therefore, we vary the method, sometimes poison, sometimes blade, sometimes blunt trauma, sometimes strangulation. The method matters less than our consciousness during the act. We are training ourselves to kill with perfect rational clarity, without emotional interference, without moral distortion. But the killings were not the ultimate goal of the project. They were, in Margaret's terminology, the preparation. Preparation for what the Crawfords considered the true purpose of their work. Creating a child who would be born free of moral conditioning, who would be raised by parents who had successfully eliminated their own moral constraints, and who would therefore represent the first truly free human being. From January 1931, Thomas and I have decided the preparation is nearly complete. We have killed 12 people. With each killing, we have observed ourselves growing more capable of action unconstrained by moral hesitation. We are ready for the next phase, the creation of a child who will embody everything we have achieved. This child will be conceived by parents who have freed themselves from moral conditioning. This child will be gestated by a mother who has eliminated fear and guilt. This child will be born into an environment free of social moral pressure. This child will be raised by parents who can teach the truth about morality, that it is arbitrary, constructed, optional. This child will be the proof that humans can transcend the evolutionary and social programming that constrains ordinary people. Margaret became pregnant in March 1931. The journal entries following this describe her pregnancy as a philosophical project as much as a biological one. She and Thomas conducted what they called prenatal conditioning, exposing the developing fetus to experiences designed to influence its neurological development. From May 1931, I have been reading extensively about prenatal development and environmental influences on fetal neurology. While the fetus cannot learn in the traditional sense, the mother's stress hormones, emotional states, and even the sounds and vibrations to which the fetus is exposed can influence neural development. Thomas and I have been conducting exercises designed to condition the fetus toward calmness in circumstances that would normally produce stress. I deliberately expose myself to stimuli that would frighten or disturb most pregnant women, reviewing photographs of our work, revisiting the sites where we conducted the preparation, handling the preserved tongues while explaining to the fetus, who can hear my voice by the 3rd trimester, what these represent and why we collected them. The goal is a child whose neural development has been shaped toward emotional neutrality and rational clarity from the earliest possible stage. The journal's final entries from September 1931 reveal that Margaret and Thomas had planned to conclude the preparation with a final 13th killing, one that would be different from the previous 12. They had decided that Thomas would be the 13th subject. From September 15, 1931, Thomas and I have reached agreement on the final phase. To truly demonstrate that we have transcended moral conditioning, I must be willing to kill the person I love most, and Thomas must be willing to be killed by me. This will prove several things: that our project is not merely sadism or aggression towards strangers, but genuine philosophical commitment; that we value the success of our work more than individual survival; and that we can act with perfect rationality even when personal attachment would normally create emotional interference. The method has been chosen. I will administer poison to Thomas, then deliver the child by my own hand via cesarean section after his death, but while I still have sufficient strength. The child will be born into the immediate aftermath of the final preparation, will emerge into a space where the ultimate boundary has been crossed. This timing is intentional. It creates the most philosophically pure conditions for birth. From September 17, 1931, Thomas has prepared everything. He has written detailed instructions for how I am to conduct the delivery after his death. He has assembled the medical supplies I will need. He has mapped the route I should take to reach the Chandalar village where I can obtain assistance after the birth. He is calm, rational, and fully committed. Tomorrow, we complete the work we began 5 years ago. The final entry, dated September 19, 1931, is the one found by the hunters. Thomas has finished the preparation. The child kicks inside me, eager to be born into what we have made. We have taken 13 lives to create the conditions for one life, a life that will be born understanding what we understand, seeing what we see, capable of what we will become. The exchange is complete. Tomorrow, we cross together. But something went wrong with the Crawfords plan. When the hunters discovered Margaret's body in November 1931, she had been dead for approximately 2 months, and medical examination revealed the fetus had died approximately 6 weeks before Margaret herself died. The territorial medical examiner, Dr. George Halston, filed a report that struggled to make sense of the timeline. The fetal death occurred approximately at the end of July or beginning of August 1931. This would have been obvious to the mother. Fetal movement would have ceased, physical changes consistent with intrauterine fetal demise would have been apparent. Yet Mrs. Crawford's journal entries continue through September, describing the fetus as active and viable. Either she was in such complete denial that she could not acknowledge the obvious fact of fetal death, or, and I hesitate to suggest this, she was aware of the fetal death but was describing something other than physical reality in her journal. The final weeks of entries have a quality that might be described as dissociative or delusional. More puzzling was the complete absence of Thomas Crawford's body. The cabin and surrounding area were searched extensively. No body was found. No grave was found. No evidence of violence or struggle was found. Thomas Crawford had simply vanished. The territorial investigation, led by Detective Harold Worth, produced a report that was classified upon completion and not released until 1975. The report concludes, "We believe Thomas Crawford is deceased, though we cannot determine cause of death or location of remains. We believe Margaret Crawford poisoned her husband, as planned, but that the psychological stress of the act, combined with the earlier unacknowledged fetal death, precipitated a complete mental breakdown. She likely disposed of her husband's body in a manner she does not accurately record in her journal, possibly in the river, possibly buried in a location she did not note or later could not remember." She then remained in the cabin for approximately 6 weeks, gradually dying of exposure, malnutrition, and possibly self-inflicted injuries resulting from her attempt to deliver the already dead fetus via cesarean without medical knowledge or proper tools. The alternative explanation, that Thomas Crawford is alive and successfully fled the scene, seems unlikely given the timeline and environmental conditions. However, we cannot entirely exclude this possibility. If Thomas Crawford survived and remains at large, he should be considered extremely dangerous, a person who has deliberately eliminated normal moral constraints and who has demonstrated capability for methodical violence. The 13 labeled jars were cross-referenced with missing persons reports. 12 of the 13 names matched individuals who had disappeared in the Brooks Range region between November 1930 and September 1931. The 13th jar was labeled Thomas Isaiah Crawford, September 18, 1931, silenced, and contained a tongue that DNA analysis, conducted in 1998 when the evidence was retested using modern techniques, confirmed belonged to Thomas Crawford. This physical evidence suggests that Margaret did successfully kill and mutilate her husband as planned, but where his body went remains unknown. The journal and other evidence were presented to a territorial grand jury in March 1932. The grand jury declined to indict Margaret Crawford posthumously, a legal impossibility in any case, but did issue a report finding that Thomas and Margaret Crawford were responsible for at least 13 deaths in Alaska Territory between November 1930 and September 1931, motivated by philosophical beliefs that rejected conventional morality and sought to demonstrate human capacity to act without ethical constraint. The report recommended that the case materials be sealed to prevent providing a template for others who might be inspired by the Crawfords' philosophical justifications for violence. Governor George Parks accepted this recommendation, and the case was classified for 43 years. When the materials were finally released in 1975, they created a brief sensation in criminology and philosophy circles. The Crawfords represented something unusual in the annals of crime, not killers motivated by passion, profit, or pathology, but killers motivated by systematic philosophical reasoning and deliberate self-modification. Dr. Robert Hare, the psychologist who developed the psychopathy checklist, reviewed the Crawford materials in 1978 and concluded, "The Crawfords were not psychopaths in the clinical sense. Psychopaths lack empathy due to neurological differences present from birth or early development. The Crawfords appear to have had normal empathic capacity that they deliberately destroyed through systematic desensitization. They represent something potentially more dangerous than natural psychopathy, intentional psychopathy, achieved through philosophical conviction and self-directed psychological conditioning. This suggests that the capacity for remorseless violence is not limited to those born with empathic deficits, but can be cultivated by sufficiently motivated individuals who believe morality is arbitrary." Dr. Jonathan Kellerman, a clinical psychologist and crime novelist, wrote about the Crawfords in his 1981 book, Savage Spawn. What makes the Crawford case so disturbing is not the violence itself. The number of victims is actually relatively small by serial killer standards. What's disturbing is the coherence of their reasoning and the systematic nature of their self-modification. They identified moral constraints as learned behaviors, correctly noted that such behaviors can be unlearned, and methodically unlearn them. They were right about the mechanics, even as they were catastrophically wrong about whether one should employ those mechanics. This creates a frightening possibility that anyone with sufficient philosophical conviction and discipline might replicate their process, deliberately transforming themselves from normal humans into remorseless killers. The philosophical community's response was divided and uncomfortable. Most philosophers condemned the Crawfords project as a perverse misapplication of philosophical reasoning. But a few noted that the Crawfords had identified a genuine philosophical problem, one that moral philosophy has never fully resolved. Dr. Susan Wolf, in a 1983 paper titled The Crawford Paradox, wrote, "If we accept that morality is a social construct rather than an objective feature of reality, a position held by many contemporary philosophers, then on what grounds do we obligate anyone to follow moral rules?" The Crawfords argued that if morality is constructed, it is optional. Most of us would reject this conclusion, but on what basis? We might say that morality, even if constructed, serves important social functions and therefore should be maintained. But this is a pragmatic argument, not a logical one. If an individual doesn't care about social cohesion and is capable of acting without social consequence, what logical argument compels them to observe moral constraints? The Crawfords forced this question into the real world, and philosophy still doesn't have a fully satisfactory answer. The indigenous Gwich'in perspective on the Crawfords, preserved in oral accounts and in a 1989 interview with Elder Mary Moses, offers a different framework. Our people understood what those two were before they understood it themselves. There are some people born with a split, a separation between the human part and the animal part. Most people have both parts integrated. The human part gives us compassion, cooperation, the ability to live in community. The animal part gives us the capacity for violence when necessary for survival. But some people are born with these parts separated, and the human part is weak. These people can become dangerous if they feed the animal part and starve the human part. But those Crawford people, they weren't born split. They split themselves deliberately. That's worse. That's choosing to become what you're not supposed to be. Our old people would say they were feeding a darkness that should be starved. They were making themselves into Notlakit, a word that means something like voluntarily possessed. When you deliberately remove your own humanity, something else moves into the space you've created. Not a spirit from outside, but something that was always in you, but should have stayed small and controlled. They made it big. They let it take over. And then they wanted to birth a child into that darkness, wanted to create a baby that would never have a chance to develop the human part. That's the worst thing they did, not the killings, terrible as those were, but trying to create a child who would be born into evil deliberately. The question of what happened to Thomas Crawford's body has never been resolved. Several theories exist. The river theory. Margaret disposed of Thomas's body in the Chandalar River after killing him. This is the official explanation, though it doesn't account for how a woman 7 months pregnant and beginning to show signs of psychological breakdown could have moved a full-grown man's body to the river and successfully ensured it wouldn't be recovered. The burial theory. Margaret buried Thomas somewhere near the cabin in a location that was not discovered during the search. Permafrost makes burial difficult in the Brooks Range, but not impossible during the brief summer thaw. However, extensive searching with ground-penetrating radar in the 1990s found no evidence of grave sites near the cabin. The survival theory. Thomas is not dead. He faked his death, allowed Margaret to believe she had killed him, removed his own tongue as evidence, an act of remarkable pain tolerance but not impossible for someone who had spent years deliberately dulling their pain responses, and escaped the area. This theory accounts for the missing body, but requires accepting that Thomas abandoned his pregnant wife to die alone, left behind evidence that would make him hunted for murder, and successfully disappeared into the Alaska wilderness without ever being identified. If this theory is correct, Thomas Crawford might have lived decades longer, possibly under a different identity, possibly even still alive as of the 1990s when the case received renewed attention. The animal theory. Thomas's body was removed from the area by scavengers after Margaret disposed of it improperly. Wolves, bears, and wolverines are capable of scattering remains widely enough that recovery becomes nearly impossible. This theory explains the missing body, but not how Margaret, in her deteriorating condition, transported it away from the cabin to where scavengers could access it. None of these theories is entirely satisfactory. The mystery of Thomas Crawford's disappearance remains unresolved. The fate of the Crawfords' child, the fetus that died in utero before Margaret herself died, raises its own questions. Dr. Halston's examination determined the fetus was female, approximately 7 months gestational age, and showed no obvious congenital abnormalities. The cause of fetal death could not be determined. It might have been natural. Spontaneous fetal demise occurs in approximately 1 in 160 pregnancies in the 3rd trimester, or it might have been the result of Margaret's extreme stress, her documented self-harm practices, or even deliberate action on her part. Margaret's journal entries from August and September 1931, the period after the fetus had died but before Margaret acknowledged this, if she ever did, have a quality that medical professionals have struggled to characterize. She continues to describe fetal movement, continues to refer to the pregnancy as progressing normally, continues to discuss her plans for delivery and what she will teach the child after birth. Either she was in profound denial about the fetal death, or she had experienced a complete dissociative break that allowed her to construct an alternative reality in which the pregnancy continued. Some researchers have suggested a third possibility, that Margaret was aware of the fetal death but continued her journal entries as a kind of literary project, describing not what was happening but what should have happened, what she had planned to happen, the culmination of the project that she and Thomas had worked toward. Under this interpretation, the final weeks of journal entries are not delusion, but deliberate fiction. Margaret writing the conclusion to a story that reality had interrupted. If this interpretation is correct, it raises the disturbing possibility that Margaret's consciousness in her final weeks was divided. Part of her, aware that everything had failed, the fetus was dead, Thomas was dead, or gone, the project had collapsed, while another part continued to narrate the successful completion of the work, describing the reality that should have existed. If this interpretation is correct, it raises the disturbing possibility that Margaret's consciousness in her final weeks was divided. Part of her, aware that everything had failed, the fetus was dead, Thomas was dead, or gone, the project had collapsed, while another part continued to narrate the successful completion of the work, describing the reality that should have existed. The cabin itself was left standing for several years after the discovery, marked on territorial maps but avoided by trappers and hunters who knew its history. In 1937, someone, identity unknown, burned it to the ground. Only the stone foundation remained, gradually disappearing under vegetation and permafrost shifts. In 1990, a documentary filmmaker named Catherine Ross attempted to locate the exact site of the Crawford cabin for a film about Alaska's unsolved mysteries. She was guided by Peter Moses, son of the original guide who had helped discover the cabin. They found what they believed to be the foundation remnants. Ross later described the experience in a 1992 interview. "There's something wrong with that place. I'm not superstitious, but standing on that foundation, I felt physically ill, nauseated, dizzy, overwhelmed with a sense of dread that had no rational source. Peter felt it too. He said his father had told him that the Gwich'in people wouldn't go near that site anymore, that after the Crawfords' deaths, the place had become contaminated, not with physical poison, but with something spiritual or psychological. His father's term was Katranawa, place where humans unmade themselves. Peter said, once you deliberately unmake your humanity in a location, that unmaking soaks into the place itself. The ground remembers what happened there. We didn't stay long. We got our footage and left. I filmed in a lot of remote locations, including other crime scenes. That was the only place I've ever felt genuine fear, standing in broad daylight with another person present. The 13 tongues preserved by the Crawfords were buried with their respective victims after those victims were identified. A small memorial was erected in Fairbanks in 1985, listing the names of the known victims. 12 names, with a 13th line reading, "Unknown, possibly Thomas Isaiah Crawford." The journal itself remains in the Alaska State Archives, available to researchers but rarely requested. Archivists report that most researchers who do request it don't finish reading it. The combination of philosophical sophistication and moral emptiness proves too disturbing for sustained engagement. Dr. Sarah Chen, who reviewed the journal for a 2010 study on criminal psychology, wrote, "The most unsettling aspect of Margaret Crawford's journal is not the descriptions of violence, disturbing as those are, but the calm rationality that pervades every page. She writes the way a scientist writes lab notes, the way an engineer writes technical specifications. There is no indication that she ever doubted the project, ever felt genuine guilt or remorse, ever questioned whether the philosophical framework she and Thomas had constructed might be wrong. She writes as someone who has achieved perfect intellectual consistency at the cost of everything that makes humans human. Reading the journal is like watching someone methodically disassemble their own soul, describing each step in clear, rational language." The Crawford case remains one of the most philosophically disturbing cases in American criminal history, not because of the number of victims, which is relatively small, or the level of violence, which was calculated rather than frenzied, but because of the systematic reasoning that motivated the crimes, and the demonstration that ordinary humans with normal empathic capacity can deliberately transform themselves into remorseless killers through philosophical conviction and self-directed conditioning. The case raises questions that remain unresolved. To what extent is morality a learned behavior that can be unlearned? The Crawfords clearly believed it was entirely learned and successfully unlearned much of their own moral response. Does this prove that morality is purely social conditioning, or does it prove only that social conditioning can be overridden in individuals with sufficient philosophical motivation? What obligation do we have to follow moral rules if we accept that morality is socially constructed rather than objectively real? Most philosophers argue that even constructed morality serves essential social functions and therefore should be maintained. But this is a pragmatic argument, not a logical proof that individuals must follow moral rules. The Crawfords forced this question out of the abstract and into the real world, and the answer remains unclear. Can the deliberate elimination of empathy be reversed? If someone successfully desensitizes themselves to the suffering of others through systematic conditioning, is there any way to restore their empathetic capacity? The Crawfords never attempted to reverse their process, so we don't know if they could have. But this question has implications for rehabilitation theory and for understanding how much plasticity exists in our moral psychology. What would the Crawford child have become? Would she truly have been born free of moral conditioning, as Margaret and Thomas intended? Or would she have developed normal empathy despite her parents' attempts to prevent it, because empathy has evolutionary and neurological bases that can't be fully eliminated by environmental conditioning? We'll never know, but the question remains relevant for understanding the relative roles of nature and nurture in moral development. The Alaska Triangle continues to attract people seeking escape from civilization's constraints, seeking freedom from social surveillance, seeking to live according to their own rules. Most of these people are simply adventurers, naturalists, or individuals seeking solitude. But the Crawford case stands as a warning that some people seeking freedom from constraint are seeking freedom from moral constraint, and that the isolation of the Alaskan wilderness can enable not just self-reliance, but self-transformation into something monstrous. The Crawfords of Kentucky came to Alaska with a philosophical project to prove that humans could transcend moral conditioning, could act with perfect rational freedom unconstrained by empathy or ethics, could deliberately transform themselves from moral beings into amoral beings. In a terrible sense, they succeeded. They proved that moral psychology is not fixed, that empathy can be deliberately destroyed, that ordinary humans can become capable of remorseless violence through systematic self-modification. But they also proved something else, that such transformation comes at a cost that makes the freedom achieved meaningless. Margaret died alone in a freezing cabin, her husband dead or gone, her child dead inside her. Her philosophical project collapsed into madness and isolation. Whatever freedom she and Thomas achieved through their systematic elimination of moral constraint, it did not lead to the transcendent existence they had imagined. It led to death in a remote cabin, to bodies scattered across the tundra, to a legacy of horror rather than philosophical triumph. The final irony is that the Crawfords sought to demonstrate human capacity to transcend moral constraints. But what they actually demonstrated was that humans who eliminate their moral constraints don't become more than human, they become less. They demonstrated that empathy, compassion, and moral conscience are not limitations to overcome, but essential components of human consciousness, and that systematically destroying those components doesn't create a freer or more capable human, but simply creates a damaged one. The journal ends with Margaret's claim that tomorrow we cross together, she and Thomas and their unborn child, crossing into some new form of existence freed from moral constraint. But the reality was that Margaret crossed only into death, Thomas crossed into disappearance or death, and their child never crossed into life at all. The project failed. The philosophical experiment collapsed. The attempt to create the first truly free human resulted instead in 13 victims, 2 destroyed perpetrators, and 1 child who died before drawing breath. The cabin is gone now, burned to its foundation, the foundation itself slowly disappearing under decades of vegetation and permafrost shift. The 13 tongues are buried with their owners. The journal sits in an archive, rarely read, disturbing those few who do read it. Thomas Crawford's body has never been found. Margaret's body was buried in an unmarked grave in Fairbanks. At her family's request, they wanted no memorial that might attract attention or morbid curiosity. But the questions raised by the Crawfords remain. How much of morality is conditioning? How much can be unlearned? What separates those who think about transcending moral constraints from those who actually attempt it? And what should we make of the fact that 2 intelligent, educated, philosophically sophisticated people could reason their way into believing that methodical murder was not just permissible but necessary for their intellectual development? The Alaska Triangle has swallowed 16,000 people. Most vanished to accidents, to nature, to the ordinary dangers of wilderness life. But 13 vanished to something worse, to a couple who had convinced themselves that other humans were merely philosophical subjects, tools for their own self-transformation, obstacles to be removed on the path to some imagined freedom. The Crawfords too evil for history books, not because history couldn't contain their evil, but because their evil was so methodical, so philosophically elaborate, so deeply reasoned that documenting it fully risked providing a template for others. They proved that evil doesn't require hatred, doesn't require passion, doesn't even require malice. Evil simply requires the conviction that morality is optional and the discipline to act on that conviction. They came to Alaska seeking a place free enough to conduct their experiment. They found it. And in that freedom, they demonstrated something that civilization has spent millennia trying to prevent people from learning: that humans can deliberately unmake their own humanity, can systematically destroy what makes them moral beings, can transform themselves into creatures capable of treating other humans as mere objects. The experiment was complete. The preparation was finished. The project achieved its goal of creating two humans free of moral constraint. And the result was 13 bodies, one missing husband, one dead wife, one stillborn child, and the confirmation that freedom from morality is not transcendence, not evolution, but devolution, not the creation of something more than human, but the destruction of everything that makes us human at all.